Although most people think of slavery as a matter of racial oppression, sources say that between 1500 and 1800, human bondage was often based on religion rather than on race. In fact, Muslim Arabs profited from slavery centuries before Europeans explored the African continent and long before so-called West Africans were shipped across the Atlantic. In this third session of the series, Time for the Nations to Reap, we will talk about the slave drivers involved in the trafficking of the chosen people. I wanted to highlight the horrors of the Arab slave trade because it doesn't seem to get as much attention as the transatlantic slave trade. We need to know about the enemy agents that profited from slave trafficking and how Arabs made our people so accepting of the Islamic religion. I will primarily be focusing on Zanzibar off the coast of Africa, or East Africa, I should say, because this was the main slave trading port in the African Great Lakes region, and it was dominated by Arab slave traders. So I will begin with some excerpts from this article entitled East Africa's Forgotten Slave Trade. It says, over several centuries, countless East Africans were sold as slaves by Muslim Arabs to the Middle East and other places via the Sahara Desert and Indian Ocean. Experts say it is time for this to be discussed more openly. So it says, the island of Zanzibar is today considered one of East Africa's best destinations. White sandy beaches, crystal clear waters, and hotels offer tourists from all over the world a holiday to remember. Long forgotten is the dark past that overshadowed this sunny paradise 200 years ago. The archipelago, which today is a semi-autonomous part of Tanzania, was then regarded as the center of the East African slave trade. In addition to valuable raw materials such as ivory and the coveted clothes, one thing stood out above all others in the colorful markets: hundreds of slaves. It says the sale of African slaves can be traced back to antiquity. It became popular in the 7th century when Islam was gaining strength in North Africa. This was 7 centuries before Europeans explored the continent and 10 centuries before West Africans were sold across the Atlantic to America. Continuing, it says, back then, Arab Muslims in North and East Africa sold captured Africans to the Middle East. There, they worked as field workers, teachers, or harem guards, which is why the castration of male slaves was common practice. Muslims, on the other hand, including African Muslims, were not allowed to be enslaved according to Islamic legal views. Continuing on, it says the slave trade in East Africa really took off from the 17th century. More and more merchants from Oman settled in Zanzibar. The island took on an even more important role in the international trade of goods due to the large trade at the Swahili coast and consequently also in the slave trade. This is how the largest slave market in East Africa was created. Only estimates, some of which vary widely, exist as to how many Africans were sold from East to North Africa. This is also due to the fact that many of the slaves perished. Scientific research concludes that about 3 out of 4 slaves died before they reached the market where they were to be sold. The causes were hunger, illness, or exhaustion after long journeys. So I really want us to learn more about this slave trade that's often not talked about because it was brutal. It may not be considered worse than the transatlantic slave trade, but we need to know how bad it was. Again, it's time for the nations to reap what they have sown. Now I'll read just a snippet from this article entitled "The West and East African Slave Trades Compared," and this is coming from developingworldpolitics.com. It says the West African trade was shorter in duration and more intense in terms of number of slaves shipped per year than the East Africa one. The West African trade lasted about 300 years, with Portugal being the first trader in the 1400s, finally ending right around the time it lost control of Kenya in 1700. Perhaps the West African slave trade was more professionalized and thus able to export more slaves per year because each European power had its own territory and business venture clearly defined. In comparison, the East African trade was lower impact but sustained for longer. Arab settlements in places like Kenya and Tanzania, the latter of which was the largest source of slaves for Arabs, created the Swahili culture and language. Arabs established an African slave trade to the Middle East long before the Europeans did, as early as the 7th century. Trade reached its peak in the 18th century. But there is even a story of the Sultan of Oman bringing slaves to the coronation of Queen Elizabeth in 1953, long after the trade had ended. It is important to note the difference in the nature of the two slave trades. The transatlantic trade was chattel-based, and slaves were worked to death with hard labor in the Americas. Those slaves owned by Christians were rarely able to keep their families together or buy their own freedom. Slaves in the Arab world often had families and were able to possibly buy their own freedom over time based on Quranic principles. East African slaves had a small degree of rights, and much of the female labor came in the form of domestic servitude rather than agricultural. So I'm going to share excerpts from this book, The East African Slave Trade and the Measures Proposed for Its Extinction as Viewed by Residents in Zanzibar. And this was written by Captain H.A. Fraser, the Right Reverend Bishop Tozier, and James Christie. And this was written in 1871. The author begins by saying, I think all those who have any actual knowledge of East African slavery are agreed that the horrors of the march to the coast and of the sea passage can scarcely be exaggerated, but that the moral degradation of both slave and master is the worst feature of actual slavery under Arab owners. Apprentices to an English sugar planter would be in almost every respect worse off than a slave now is. We have not now to do with anything which at all resembles the old West Indian or the more recent United States slavery. The English were infinitely worse masters than the Arabs are, and even now the Englishmen generally have a very much less kindly feeling towards a free Negro than the Arabs have towards their slaves. It says to put a stop to the horrible cruelties of the slave caravan and the slave ship is a very worthy object for any Christian nation, but then it must be followed by a real care for those who are released, or else our philanthropy condemns itself. Continuing, it says the origin of slavery in East Africa is lost in obscurity, but shortly after the establishment of Arab power on its seaboard, we read of the existence of a maritime slave traffic. Dropping down, it says the mode of conducting this traffic, the report describes in ample detail. It records the organization of armed expeditions to the countries adjoining Lake Nyassa, the attack on the victims to be enslaved, the depopulation of the country, the horrors of the journey to the coast, the numbers murdered or left to die on the road. But it omits all allusion to the still greater atrocities perpetuated on the miserable survivors of that dreadful journey by the dealers who purchased them at Kilwa, the port of export, for shipment to Zanzibar. So they did have one advantage here. This says the slaves are encouraged to contract marriages and live in family, and in the event of their not finding wives on the estate, it is customary to purchase those for them to whom they have formed an attachment. The marriages are regarded as binding in the same sense as they are amongst the Arabs, but they are not contracted before the Kathi, the master of the estate, or his deputy being in the place of and having the same power as the Kathi. It says the offspring of these marriages are called Wazalia, and they occupy a much higher position among the slave population than those who have been brought directly from the mainland. Continuing on, I want you to pay attention to this part. It says, it is said that the slave dealers start for the interior. This is how they go in for their raids. They start for the interior well armed and provided with articles for the barter of slaves, such as beads and cotton, cloth, and that. On arriving at the scene of their operations, they incite and sometimes help the natives of one tribe make war upon another. They were doing this then, and they're still doing it now. Only now the European nations are doing it too. They go in and destabilize areas on the continent so that they can go in and gain access to the resources. Of course, at that time, it was mainly the people. But they win when they keep us fighting against each other. A house divided cannot stand. Family, who comes in to kill, steal, and destroy? All right, so listen what it says. It says, it is necessary for us to remind ourselves of the condition of North Africa in the times immediately preceding the advent of Islam. It says Christianity ruled the land, but woefully weakened and rent by wild heresies and schisms. Mighty fathers of the church had found a home, had done work throughout that region. Tertullian, Origen, Cyprian, Augustine, and many others. It is said that there were 400 or 500 bishops, which means, of course, thousands of churches and priests. So it says gradually the Christian population was overwhelmed. Slowly the Moors or Berbers were converted to the Mohammedan faith and allegiance. The Arabs that had come from Asia through Egypt into the northern desert were gradually merged with the Berber race that was closely akin. The remnants of other races there present were slowly absorbed until all coalesced under the banner of Islam, unitedly turning their faces toward Mecca. It says it is largely through native agency that Islam has been propagated in Africa. For the Arabs that penetrate the interior, whether for good or ill, may now be called natives of the country. They are recognized by the Negro as in it, if not fully of it. In the wide inclusiveness of the races to which we have already referred concerning Africa, the Arabs are now certainly of the native population. Even the invaders of Zanzibar a century ago have made Africa their home and have identified themselves, though disastrously, with the native races. The difference, listen, between the white man and the Arab in native estimation shows clearly that the Arab is to be counted as an indigenous agent. This is why they're calling them agents, because they lived among the people, looked like the people, but they were not of them. Think of Judas. It says, let us refer again to the Hauses and the Fullahs, the Fulanis, as perhaps the most conspicuous agents in the great advance of Mohammedanism throughout Western and Central Sudan. These magnificent tribes, one purely Negro and the other mixed, but now essentially native, have carried Mohammedanism through the forests, from the desert to the ocean in one direction and to the lakes in the other. Now listen, so that you can see why so many of our people became Muslims. It says the Arab missionaries whom we have met in the interior go without purse or scrip and disseminate their religion by quietly teaching the Quran. The native missionaries, Mandingos and Fullahs, unite with the propagation of their faith active trading. Wherever they go, they produce the impression that they are not preachers only, but traders. But on the other hand, they are not traders merely, but preachers. And in this way, silently and almost unobtrusively, they are causing princes to become obedient disciples and zealous propagators of Islam. So it says, after making all due allowance, we are left with these simple facts: that indigenous agents have been at work, particularly throughout Western and Central Sudan, hardly in the beautiful and self-denying way described, rather as men seeking self-support by means more or less honorable, but carrying with them as they go teachings of Mohammedanism and the Quran. They familiarize the pagan tribes with Islam. Doubtless they win some converts, but listen, when compulsion comes through political events, when the dreadful alternative is presented, Mohammedanism or slavery, the choice is made the more easy. Did you catch that? Basically, you should convert to Islam or you run the risk of being taken into slavery. Now, you definitely need to listen to this part. It says further, we have the somewhat significant fact that Turkey, the banner bearer of Islam, Turkey, the banner bearer of Islam, voted at the Berlin Conference for free rum in the Congo Free State. Why would Turkey ask for free rum to be given to the people in the Congo? Think about that and think about who the Turkish people are. It says we cannot avoid the conclusion that Dr. Blyden romances somewhat concerning his great total abstinence society of Central Africa. Mohammedanism asserting temperance, if not total abstinence, fails to enforce its command in Africa, as we are told elsewhere. Listen, the Arabs themselves are the chief importers of intoxicating spirits into Africa. So they promote abstinence among themselves. But let's give them all the alcohol they want in the Congo. The Europeans are using the same playbook. Keep them drugged up and drunk and create other addictions so that we can better control them. Didn't the CIA put crack in the black community? Esau has been dealing shrewdly with us. It says, in the African slave trade, we have what Livingstone called the open sore of the world. Not only is Mohammedanism the religion of the slave driver, Mohammedanism sanctions the slave trade and is responsible in the last analysis for the widespread demand that has prolonged the export slave trade of late. We recognize the fact that Mohammedanism restricts the slave trade somewhat, so far as Mohammedans are concerned. While there are Mohammedans that are slaves, and while the common assertion that Mohammedans are exempted from slavery is an error, it is certainly true that throughout Africa, the Mohammedan slave traders make their raids rather upon tribes that are not Mohammedans, but to attack slavery in Mohammedan countries, listen, is to interfere with the institutions to which Islam gives a religious sanction. Now let's add some information from this news article recalling Africa's harrowing tale of its first slavers, the Arabs, as UK slave trade abolition is commemorated. So it begins by saying the 25th March was as usual, commemorated as the day Britain officially abolished its slave trade in 1807. But how many recall that Arab slavers were the first and last in modern times to ship millions of Africans out of the continent as slaves, and the Arab slavers preferred more African women to men? So in his book Slaves and Slavery that was published in 1998, British writer Duncan Clark defined slavery as the reduction of fellow human beings to the legal status of chattels, allowing them to be bought and sold as goods. This, in essence, is what both the Arabs and Europeans did to Africans, to justify the shipping of millions of Africans as slaves to faraway lands in Asia, in particular the Middle East and the Americas. It says the African slave trade, surely one of the most tragic and disturbing episodes in the history of mankind, Clark writes, had its origins in the intervention of forces from the civilizations that developed in the regions of the Mediterranean Sea, today's Europe and the Middle East, into the arena of the more fragmented civilizations of sub-Saharan Africa. He says Africa became a source of slaves for the cultures of the Mediterranean world many centuries before the discovery of the Americas. But it was that discovery and the resulting shift in focus towards the Atlantic that prompted the culminating explosive growth in slavery with such tragic effect. Slavery, in fact, was a central feature of life in the Mediterranean world, especially in Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, Greece, Imperial Rome, and the Islamic societies of the Middle East and North Africa. So it says, throughout the 19th century, the Omani Arab rulers of Zanzibar shipped hundreds of thousands of African slaves to work on clove plantations on the islands. It was this trade that gave Europe and America so much satisfaction after abolishing their own trade in African slaves, to highlight the wickedness of the Arab slavers who continued to ensure Africans who continued to enslave Africans well into the first decades of the 20th century. Even to this day, Arabs are still at work in Sudan and Mauritania buying and selling black Africans. So David Livingstone, the British missionary, traveler, explorer, was so upset by the way Arabs treated their African slaves that he wrote back home in 1870, and this is what he wrote: in less than I take to talk about it, these unfortunate creatures, 84 of them, wended their way into the village where we were. Some of them, the eldest, were women from 20 to 22 years of age, and there were youths from 18 and 19, but the large majority was made up of boys and girls from 7 years to 14 or 15 years of age. He says, a more terrible scene than these men, women, and children I do not think I ever came across. To say that they were emaciated would not give you an idea of what human beings can undergo when under certain circumstances. Each of them had his neck in a large forked stick, weighing from 30 to 40 pounds and 5 or 6 feet long, cut with a fork at the end of it where the branches of a tree spread out. The women were tethered with bark thongs, which are, of all things, the most cruel to be tied with. Of course, they are soft and supple when first stripped off the trees, but a few hours in the sun make them about as hard as the iron round packing cases. He said, the little children were fastened by thongs to their mothers. As we passed along the path which these slaves had traveled, I was shown a spot in the bushes where a poor woman, the day before, unable to keep on the march and likely to hinder it, was cut down by the axe of one of these slave drivers. We went on further and were shown a place where a child lay. It had been recently born, and its mother was unable to carry it from debility and exhaustion. So the slave trader had taken this little infant by the feet. And we have prophecy about this in Scripture where they would dash the children, dash their heads. And that's what happened to this child, this baby. So he says, such was the brutality meted out to the Africans by the Arabs. Like the Atlantic trade, the Arabian trade's Middle Passage was equally as horrible and terrifying. The Middle Passage, describing the harrowing journey lasting several months from Africa's west coast to the Americas, during which millions of Africans packed like sardines in the slave ships died of thirst, hunger, rough seas, and sometimes from the sheer brutality inflicted by the European slavers. He goes on to say, in the Arabian trade, the trudge across the Sahara in leg and neck chains, and as Livingstone describes above, necks in large forked sticks and hands tied with bark thongs, was particularly harsh on the African slaves. Says Duncan Clark, the hardships of these long marches across the desert were considerable, and much later travelers reported that the routes were lined with the parched skeletons of those who had succumbed to exhaustion and thirst along the way. The Arab slavers did not only march their African captives to Arabia, they also sometimes sold them to European slavers. It says, in modern times, the popular image of African slavery springs from the vision of a tormented male suffering under the lash of unceasing labor on some New World sugar plantation. Yet the real face of servitude finds its focus in the forced migration of millions of girls and young women across the Sahara and the Horn of Africa into the institutions of Islamic concubinage. So why did they prefer the women? It says, while in the European New World, the measure of a man's stature was mapped out and calibrated on the physical dimensions of empire, built upon the sinews of forced masculine labor, in the Islamic Orient, wealth was a reflection of prestige. Young girls, the vessel of male hubris, the mats of male pleasure ground, the malleable material to be shaped to the master's will. Thus, women slaves in the Arab world were often turned into concubines, living in harems and rarely as wives, their children becoming free. A large number of male slaves and young boys were castrated and turned into eunuchs who kept watch over the harems. Castration was a particularly brutal operation with a survival rate of only 10%. Just think about that. Now think about why they preferred the women. Because it allowed these people to increase their race. These women were bearing their seed. And what were they doing to the men? Castrating them to cut off their seed. But not only that, when you only have a survival rate of 10%, what was this really about, you all? It says the combined effect of all these factors, says Duncan Clark, was a steady demand for slaves throughout the Islamic world, which had cover story to be met from wars, raids, or purchases along the borders with non-Islamic regions. Although some of these slaves came from Russia, the Balkans, and Central Asia, the continuing expansion of Islamic regimes in sub-Saharan Africa made black Africans the major source. The article goes on to say, in the Atlantic trade, the slaves came predominantly from Africa's west coast, with a male-female ratio of 2:1. In the Arabian trade, the slaves were exclusively from the Savannah and the Horn of Africa and favored females over males at a ratio nearing 3:1. So it says when slavery in the Black Sea area, the traditional source of the best grade female slaves for the Arab market, dried up, it triggered an even greater demand for Ethiopian or red slaves, in particular the Galla or Oromo, on account of their unquestioned beauty and willing sexual temperament. And while the Europeans paid a higher price for male slaves than females, the reverse was the case with the Arabs. Moreover, while the European New World slavers profited mainly from male labor, the Arabs saw profit in sexual satisfaction, reproductive potential. So these offspring of the union between Islamic master and female slaves was born free. However, they were increasing their populations. So it says any offspring of the Atlantic trade were born into slavery. The laws of Islam, as the historian Hugh Thomas attests, were in some ways more benign in respect of slavery than were those of Rome. Slaves were not to be treated as if they were animals. Slaves and freemen were equal from the point of view of God. The master did not have power of life and death over his slave property. But to the Africans shipped across the Red Sea, the benign Islamic laws provided little comfort. They were still slaves of Islamic masters who had unfettered sexual access to them if they were female, or castrated and turned into eunuchs if they were men. Who are we talking about here, family? So this book that was written by Joseph A. Peace in 1895 says how we countenance slavery. It says this raiding of slaves throughout the interior of equatorial Africa is still practiced by the Arabs to an almost incredible extent. Estimates vary considerably as to the exact number of Negroes who are annually subjected to these raids. But of the 300,000 to 500,000 who are thus raided, that is a lot of people. It is believed that not more than 10% actually reach the coast. Listen to this. 9 out of every 10 are left to perish on their long, unhealthy journey from the interior or die as a direct result of the slave raid in a manner too horrible to contemplate. Now I want to touch on a few things in this article entitled Domestic Slavery, Skin Color, and the Image Dialectic in 13th Century Arabic Manuscripts. So I'm going to drop down. It says, generally, not much has been written about the politics of slavery's archive in medieval Islam, how the documents that recorded the subjection of the enslaved repeated or alternatively complicated the social and racial hierarchies inherent to their production. So the author points out a major difference between the East and West slave trade. It says, another major difference is that slave origins were quite varied and scattered, in contrast with the Atlantic slave trade, whose main source was Central and West Africa, and which thus sutured slavery to the black body. In pre-modern Islam and the medieval Mediterranean more broadly, the only basis for enslavement was a person's foreignness. Almost anyone could become a slave. Slavery was a universal threat. As Hannah Barker has put it, slave origins encompassed various parts of Africa, Europe, the Balkans, Anatolia, Transoxiana, and South Asia. Skin color and geographical origins were not criteria for enslavement. And this is where I need to pause, because Europeans offer the rebuttal of white people being taken into slavery too. But no one bothers to ask the question, who did it? The Barbary pirates of North Africa were mainly Muslims. Let's also point out that in comparison to Africans, only a small percentage of their population was enslaved. They were not stripped of their identity and reclassified as chattel. They were not shipped around the world with yokes of iron around their necks. The point is, we're using scripture to show how the enslavement of our ancestors fit the descriptions given to us in the Bible. And based on Joel 3, the Most High is going to judge the nations that enslaved his people. So why should we get over it and stop talking about it if he hasn't? Let's keep going. It says, even religion did not actually protect people from being exchanged as slaves. Although religious difference formed the legal and ideological foundation of slavery in Islam, documentary evidence shows that in reality, Muslim slaves did exist. It goes on to say slaves were captured in violent ways, in war or through kidnapping, piracy, and raiding before they were sold at slave markets. Various acts of subjugation marked the transition from freedom to slavery, including violent capture, sexual mutilation in the case of the eunuchs, the objectifying process of physical inspection at the slave market, and the ascription of slave names. Let's look at this verse from Amos 1:11, because it makes it very clear why the horrendous treatment against us has been so severe. And I'm going to read this from the Septuagint because the other translations read it a bit differently. So it says, thus says the Most High, for 3 sins of Idumea, that's talking about Edom, and for 4, I will not turn away from them, because They pursued their brother with the sword and destroyed the mother upon the earth, and summoned up his anger for a testimony, and kept up his fury to the end. As I said, Esau has gotten his revenge on us. They refuse to show any compassion. Their anger has been unstoppable, and they refuse to control their fury. So I hope you understand that this is a physical and spiritual battle. But the Most High promised to contend with those who contend with us. Every nation that had a part in our captivity will be judged and made to pay for what they did. The Arab nations are just as guilty as the European nations. So I'm going to leave you with this verse right here from Ezekiel 25:14. The Most High says, I will lay my vengeance on Edom by the hand of my people Israel. Don't miss that point. That they may do in Edom according to my anger and according to my fury, and they shall know my vengeance, says the Most High. So we need to know that we will not remain on the bottom. And I know there are days when you cry out, Father, how long? The souls under the altar in heaven are asking the same question. But don't miss what he says here. He says he will do in Edom according to his anger and according to his fury. So we see that Abba Yah gets angry too. But just know that hands will be laid on some folks. The point of it is that we have to move at the Father's word. The power to defeat our enemies come from him. Until then, what should we be doing? Preparing ourselves, because Judah will go up first. And you need to be ready to come out swinging. And it will be more than chairs this time. I hope this message has been a blessing to you. If it has, be sure to hit the like, share it, and you're welcome to subscribe if you have not already done so. Be blessed, family.